So before we get started, I just want to mention a few ground rules. So if everyone can please mute themselves just so we can keep background noise to a minimum, that would be great. And we will have a chance for questions later on, and you can also type questions in the chat if you have them along the way. So if you can please rename yourself in your display. If it says something other than the name you would like to be called on, that would be great. And also, at the end of the session, as I mentioned, we are going to be able to hear from our mock reviewers. So the questions that you might pose during the session, if they're really germane to what we're talking about, we'll try to answer them quickly, but any substantive questions we'll save until the end. So one thing we know is that sometimes the grant review process can seem like, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, or some sort of a scary secret order seance. And so what we're trying to do today is really kind of demystify the whole process. And so to do that, we're going to talk first just about the process, kind of what happens when your grant gets submitted and works its way through the system, and then what happens during the review process. Then we're going to give you what we think is going to be quite a realistic preview of an actual grant review. So we'll be doing 3 grants, 2 R01s and an R21. And at the end, we'll have some words of wisdom from our expert reviewers, as well as Kathy and myself, who have served on many study sections. So in terms of what happens, probably the most important thing that happens after you submit your grant is it gets assigned to a study section. And it's really important to realize that the study section is not the institute to which you submit. So while you might submit your grant to NICHD or NIAAA, the grant itself will go into a study section that will have grants from multiple institutes, but have some common theme around them. So as you can see in the panel, some examples of standing study sections that are organized by content area, not by institute. After your grant is submitted, conflicts of interest will be determined, and that really comes in 2 different forms. First would be anyone from your institution. You would have a conflict of interest in terms of reviewing their grant, as well as anyone that you have any prior collaboration with. So your grant would be examined by NIH, and then also examined by the full study section to make sure there's no conflicts of interest. And then it would be assigned by what's called a SRO, or a scientific review officer, and a study section chair, who is a scholar who's serving on the study section, who kind of oversees the scientific discussion. And another important thing to realize is that reviewers have up to 12 grants that they're reviewing at any given study section. So this is why things like very clear and concise writing, and making sure that your specific aims page is very, very tightly written is important, because obviously the reviewers are doing lots of things in addition to reviewing grants for the study section. The materials are also then provided to the reviewers in NIH Commons. These are unblinded reviews, so the reviewers and anyone on the study section would have access to the grant itself, as well as knowledge of the investigators and co-investigators that are associated with the grant. And they would also be given a review template and a scoring guide that everyone would use as they're reviewing their grants. So this review template and scoring guide is something you're going to hear more about as we do the mock review, but it's really designed to try to standardize and calibrate the reviewers' scores as they come in. And as you can see, the scoring system is from 1 to 9, with 1 being exceptional, meaning pretty much perfect, exceptionally strong, high impact, no weaknesses, to a 9 being very few strengths and many major weaknesses. And so the reviewers would they were going to score each grant on a variety of criterion, including significance, the investigators, innovation, approach, and the environment. They also will provide information for the SRO and the program officer on issues around budget, human subjects, vertebrate animals, inclusion, and biohazards, although this information does not figure into the actual scoring of the grant. And in addition to these criterion scores, each reviewer will provide an overall preliminary score on the grant. And it's important to realize this is almost never a mathematical average of the criterion scores. Typically, significance and approach are going to weigh the heaviest in reviewers' scoring and their overall impact score. So once the scores are submitted, that will be done through NIH Commons along with a written narrative review. So the reviewers will provide their scores on each of those criterion, an overall preliminary score, as well as a written review that comes in the form of a template that covers these broad areas. And then that scientific review officer is going to generate a list of grants, which is organized by the type of grant, with typically R01s being reviewed first, followed by R21s, R03s, and then possibly K awards, depending on the study section. An important thing to realize is not all of the grants that are submitted are scored, are discussed during a study section. So typically the top 50% are going to be discussed and the rest are what are called triaged or not discussed. Now these triage grants will still get information back to the investigator about the grant. They will still get a score. They just won't be discussed in the study section. The reviewers will also have access to other critiques. And so if I were a reviewer on a grant, after I submit my grant, I would be able to see the critiques of other reviewers that are on that grant with me. And that's really helpful to kind of prepare for the discussion that's going to follow in the actual review. And just also to note that the study section might be in person, but it also is being increasingly held in a virtual format. In terms of who's in the study section, there's actually quite a few people who are going to be present. The scientific review officer is an employee of the National Institutes of Health, and they will be representing NIH to make sure procedurally everything is done appropriately, conflicts of interest are identified, and that the meeting is run in a confidential and procedurally appropriate manner. There's always also the study section chair, who again is not affiliated with NIH, but is kind of a panel member who has been selected to serve in this role, who will oversee the scientific discussion and also summarize the grant and keep the discussion moving across the review of the grants in that particular study section. And then each grant is reviewed by 3 reviewers. So we have a reviewer 1, 2, and 3. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then there's also other people who are in the room, who are on the panel, who are not assigned to the grant, but can and often do engage in discussion of the grant after the first 3 reviewers go through what they see as score driving factors. There's also often program officers that are present. Program officers do not participate in the review in any way, but they do often listen carefully when grants that have been submitted through their institute are being reviewed, and they can provide additional information to investigators if grants are reviewed in the study section where they're present. So you often have multiple program officers, maybe not one from every institute, but multiple program officers in the room who are observing the process but not participating. So the study section chair will start the process by asking for preliminary scores, and then reviewer 1 typically does the heavy lifting of describing the grant briefly to the committee and discussing score driving factors across those different criteria that we talked about: significance, innovation, approach, investigators, etc. Reviewer 2 will then provide any additional information, typically a shorter dialogue about the score driving factors of the grant. They don't have to repeat things that they agree with, although they might agree with reviewer 1, for example, that the investigative team is very strong. But they typically focus on other things that they might have seen that were either positive or concerns. And then the same with reviewer 3. They would provide additional information, but typically not reiterate things that have already been said. After the 3 reviewers provide their evaluation of the grant, there's an opportunity for discussion amongst those 3 reviewers. And this is important because sometimes issues are brought up by one reviewer that another reviewer may disagree with or may have a different perspective on. So it's an opportunity for there to be discussion just among those 3 reviewers. Then there'll be the opportunity for discussion among the entire panel, where panelists who may have looked at the grant kind of in a cursory way, even though they weren't a reviewer, or they might be very interested in the topic, or they might be familiar with the methodology, could ask clarifying questions, could ask for more information, or maybe even point out things in the grant that weren't mentioned. And then after this full discussion among the panel, the study section chair will summarize the discussion. So they're typically taking notes during the process of reviewer 1, 2, and 3 providing their reviews. So they'll summarize the discussion, and then they will ask for what are considered final scores from the reviewers. So at this point, the reviewers of the grant, the reviewer 1, 2, and 3 could change their score based on the discussion and dialogue that happens during the study section, and they will verbally indicate their scores. And then everyone on the study section will submit their scores either on paper or electronically. After this process and the grant review is officially over, the reviewers might end up modifying what they had originally prepared as their review if their scores have changed significantly, or if other issues have been brought up in review that they want to make sure is reflected in their review. They would modify their reviews, and then they would have a window to upload that information into the NIH Commons portal. Once all of the information is collected on all the grants that were reviewed in a study section, scores and percentile ranks will be posted in NIH Commons. This is typically within a few days. So within a few days of having your grant reviewed, you should be able to go into NIH Commons and see the percentile score as well as the average score of your grant, which will give you a good sense of how you're faring in terms of the submission of that grant. And within a month, you should get what's called a summary statement, which is a summary of the grant, a summary of the discussion, summary of the strengths and score driving factors, as well as the critiques of reviewers 1, 2, and 3. And from this point forward, your program officer at the institute to which you submitted the grant, or the institutes to which you submitted the grant, if it's going to multiple institutes, would become that person of contact that you could talk to about the score, about the review process, about the feedback, and sometimes they can help you kind of figure out what types of issues would be appropriate to address. And if it's considered for funding, then now the grant itself moves into another stage of evaluation at the National Institutes of Health, which is called Council, who would make the final funding decision on the grant. So Kathy, I don't know, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I'm just going to keep moving. And before we head into the actual study section, I think we're doing pretty well on time here. Just to give you a reminder, we're going to be doing a review of 3 different grants. In a real study section, these 3 grants would be reviewed in different study sections. You will see that they're actually quite different in scope and content, but we're trying to give you a sense of both an implementation science type of grant, a basic science type of grant, as well as a clinical trial, because we realize the audience is quite varied. But if this were a real study section, the grants would be more similar in terms of broad content area and often approach. Another thing that's going to be a little different in this study section is that we're going to review 3 grants, whereas in a real study section, you would review upwards of 80 grants over the course of a day or 2 days. So we're not going to keep you here to do 80 grants. We're just going to do 3. Another thing that happens in a study section that we're not going to have the opportunity to do here is that when the reviewers enter the room of the study section and they see the list of grants that are going to be both discussed and not discussed, there's always an opportunity for someone on the panel to, quote, rescue a grant. So if a grant is in the lower 50th percentile of the ranking of all the grants in the study section, but let's say it's in a content area that you're familiar with, maybe it's actually a grant that you reviewed, you would have the opportunity to rescue that grant and say, even though it's in the lower 50th percentile, I'd like this grant to be discussed. Okay, so that does happen, often happens in the case where there might be discrepant scores between multiple reviewers, where you have a real enthusiast for the review for the grant, but several other reviewers rated it very low. So there's always the opportunity for a reviewer to take a very proactive role in seeing that a grant gets reviewed, even if it gets a score that puts it in the lower 50th percentile. The other thing is that a scientific review officer, that representative of NIH, would be present at a real study section. We don't have that person here. I'm going to serve as the study section chair, so we'll kind of skip the part of making sure that people know what the NIH rules are and how we're supposed to follow procedure, and we'll move right into the scientific part of the study section. There would also be multiple program officers present. As I mentioned, we'll have one program officer present. And the last thing, which is actually quite important, we have culled actual grants from our institutions, from the University of Georgia and from Emory. And we also have our mock reviewers from those institutions. And in a real grant review, that would constitute a conflict of interest. So if you can, when you meet the reviewers, you're going to see that they come from Emory as well as University of Georgia, and we are reviewing grants from those two institutions. But rest assured, in the study section, that would be a conflict of interest. So let me just tell you who's here and how we're going to move on from here. So as I mentioned, I'm Lillian Eby. I'm going to serve as the study section chair. We also have Kathy Griedling in the audience, who is the program officer. She's going to be kind of the fly on the wall, not participating in the review process, but you will see her. You will see her in your Hollywood squares of people. And then we have 6 reviewers from the University of Georgia and from Emory that you will meet in a moment. And we will start with our first grant. So I think, Lauren, you can stop the presentation. Great, thank you. Okay, welcome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you and reviewing the grants that we have before us. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute and allow people to introduce themselves. I'm Lillian Eby from the University of Georgia. I'm an implementation scientist. I'll be serving as the study section chair. My area of expertise is in workforce development, as well as organizational psychology. And I'm just going to go around the room as I see you. So, Steve.
I'm Steve Beach from the University of Georgia and the psychology department. My area of expertise is in family processes related to health and health behavior.
Great, thank you. Ajay?
I'm Ajay Newcomb. I'm from the Department of Hematology and Oncology at Emory University. I'm a professor and I'm the Associate Director for Clinical Research. My focus is on clinical trials, and I happen to review one of the social behavioral health project on a proposal. So you'll see a difference of how I view the proposal compared to the real social behavioral people.
Great, thank you. Jennifer? Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Jennifer McDowell from the University of Georgia. I'm also a professor in the psychology department in the area of behavioral cognitive neuroscience. I'm interested primarily in psychosis and issues of cognitive control problems associated with psychosis.
Great, thank you. Sam?
Hi, I'm Sam Yalagar. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at Emory University, and our research focuses on alcohol and lung immune dysfunction and injury mechanisms, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and different treatments.
Great. Niall?
Hi, I'm Niall McCarty. I'm professor of pediatrics at Emory, and I study cystic fibrosis at kind of multiple levels from molecular through humans. Most of my lab focuses on the role of CFTR mutations, the basic defect in CF, and the development of pulmonary complications related to diabetes.
Great, thank you. Vivian? Oh, you're muted.
Wait, I'm Vivian Sheehan. I'm an associate professor of pediatrics, part of the AFLAC division. I study sickle cell disease, and I like that, Niall, at multiple levels. So mouse models, omics, red cell rheology, but all to kind of come together and vet novel therapies for sickle cell disease and hopefully find some additional ones.
Great, thank you. And we have one program officer with us today, Kathy.
Hello, I'm Kathy Grunling. I'm also from Emory University. My area of interest is vascular biology, but I'm here today representing the NIDDK in the nutrition program.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot in front of us. We have 36 grants to review today. That would be 20 R01s, 11 R21s, and 5 R03s. We don't have any K awards in this study section that we will be working on for the next couple of days. And the grants will be reviewed in the order that's in front of you. As you can see with the list of grants in front of you, we also have 35 grants that will not be discussed today. And I'd like to offer the opportunity for anyone to rescue any of those grants before we move forward. Okay, seeing that no one wants to rescue, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with the R01 grant. And this grant was submitted by Jane Smith at the University of Georgia. We have 3 reviewers, Steve Beach, Jennifer McDowell, and Ajay Nuka. And so if we can have preliminary scores, please. Reviewer 1.
2.
Reviewer 2.
2.
Reviewer 3.
4.
Okay, thank you. Reviewer 1, if you can please summarize the grant and give us a sense of your score driving factors.
This is a very exciting and important topic. The investigation is looking at the neural mechanisms associated with resilience to substance use, and focused on a somewhat younger age range than has been typical in the area in the past. It's a topic of great public health significance, although it's true that most youth exposed to adversity will not go on to develop drug or related problems. The neurocognitive protective processes that promote resilience to adversity are not very well understood currently. The present proposal aims to fill that knowledge gap and so enhance the state of science in the area. The investigator team is very strong. There are no gaps in expertise between the investigators and the research plan. And the research environment is well suited to support the research project. There's recruitment services in place that have successfully recruited youth from rural communities into the research program, and that increases the feasibility of the proposed research. I think the proposed research is innovative in several ways. I'm very excited about the potential impact of the study. The work would extend findings on neural predictors of risk for substance use, and follows a dual systems model, but includes a focus on early adversity as a focal predictor, and that's very exciting. The literature review supporting the proposal is rigorous. They review both positive and negative findings in the area, and the multi-systems focus of the data collection, including the assessment of neural function as well as family, peer, school, and community factors are all major strengths. Overall, the PI and team were very responsive to prior critiques. The PI is a new investigator with extensive experience in areas relevant to the proposal, and there's a stellar team supporting the PI. The team's environment is strong. The proposed project takes a unique focus on an early developmental period when significant brain development is occurring, and uses an ecological neuroscience focus that allows them to consider both buffering and compensatory protective processes in a low-income rural sample, all of which makes this novel. The study is characterized by a high level of methodological rigor and builds on the PI's KO1 award, which provided pilot research supporting the proposed aims and methods and hypotheses. So overall, this is a very strong proposal with potential to have a high impact on the field.
Great, thank you so much, Reviewer 1. Reviewer 2?
I agree in substance with everything Reviewer 1 says. It's definitely an important and innovative topic, and a well-researched and organized and detailed application. The team is excellent. The environment is excellent. I also think that it's particularly strong that it takes a look at not only the vulnerability of alcohol use abuse or disorders, but by looking at both protective mechanisms and buffering mechanisms, as well as risk factors. So I think that that's a outstanding approach. Being able to do this work in rural Georgia is a strength of the application as well. He clearly has shown, or the team has shown, the ability to do that. I did have one question about feasibility, which is his goal to recruit 256 7-year-olds and their parents for a 3-wave study separated by 18-month periods. I think that is going to be challenging. He mentions that the 7-year-olds are young for study of this topic, and they're also going to be put in an MRI scanner. And he did have preliminary data showing that was possible, although the preliminary data was from children within the 7 to 10-year-old age range, which is quite different from purely 7-year-olds. So I think that is one feasibility issue that wasn't mentioned by reviewer 1. Otherwise, I agree rigor. There was rigor and reproducibility, that he will pre-register his hypotheses before data collection starts.
Great, thank you. I was just trying to get some of those important points, reviewer 2. Reviewer 3, additional comments.
While I agree with the premise of the reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, I see some weaknesses in the study, and I'd go with a stepwise approach with each of these weaknesses that I could see. Number 1, so in order to obtain objectivity, the study has tried to homogenize the entire study population, homogenize the households, assumed every kid's neural cognitive networks respond or develop the same for an exposure. So fully understanding that this is extremely complex, a multidimensional scenario to provide the objectivity, I agree that this is a good attempt, but this is not comprehensive in my opinion. So the second aspect was there was exposure to the urban poverty and rural poverty were the basis on which the study was built in. When I look closely at the differences between the urban poverty and rural poverty, I feel that the investigators took a leap of faith on minimal existing data. The third aspect was they failed to show that the environmental stressors are very dynamic. So what they're talking about is a functional MRI imaging at the baseline in correlation with the behavioral aspects. And they do another follow-up functional MRI imaging at a later time. But the stressors or the risk factors are all dynamic, and they could happen over a period of time, not at a time point basis. So when I look closely at the other aspects of the weaknesses, the exclusion criteria were very broad. Say, for example, the patients who have development disorders are excluded from the study. But if you just closely look at what these development disorders are, it's a huge spectrum, and it is hard to justify using the existing exclusion criteria. The other assumption that the investigators took was drug misuse as the only way that the children turn to during adversity. So while this is an adequate endpoint, that's not the sole endpoint that I would rely on as an investigator. And last but not the least, in terms of my weaknesses for the significance aspect, so there's a clear evidence of Hawthorne effect where the study population is closely under scrutiny, under observation, and this may not be reflective of the real world, and that has not been mentioned in the proposal. Moving on to the weaknesses with the innovation, there is no data on middle childhood. These are the 7-year-olds. The investigators clearly talk about the existing data with 12-year-olds, with 10-year-olds, and just like how reviewer 2 pointed out, there is minimal data on the 7-year-olds. So think about where there's a lot of data that is collected from somebody that is not even coherent, that is not even able to fill in a survey instrument. And this is in my opinion is a big drawback in a scenario this way. The second aspect is they also briefly talk about excluding populations living in the most extreme environments. In fact, if you look at what is the biggest risk factor for drug misuse, probably those are the people who should not be excluded, and these patients are excluded as well. And there was brief mention about the talk about the ecological systems. So talking about the households, talking from the schools, So there is minimal mention about the peer relationship, which have a huge impact on the endpoint of drug misuse. Coming to the weaknesses from an approach standpoint, there were several weaknesses that I feel that needed to be talked about. One is the endpoint. If you're clearly talking about an endpoint as a drug misuse, you cannot get it by a survey instrument. You're using it as a clinician. I would be looking at a urine drug screen to look for whether the patient met the endpoint or not. So, but here we have a survey instrument that is clearly clearly talking about having an endpoint. The second one is the functional MRI, done like how I talked about as a dynamic issue, and how are these influenced by financial incentives that the study is providing. So these are all the weaknesses that I see from the significance approach perspective. I agree with the investigators. They have built this on their prior care award, so the investigators do really have a niche they found their niche in the field of how they could do functional imaging in this aspect, and I appreciate this is a good initial study, but there are several holes in the study.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ajay. Is there discussion among the reviewers?
I would say that I agree with many of the reservations and comments that have been raised, but I was viewing them a little bit differently. So, for example, focusing on a 7-year-old population struck me as a strength as much as a weakness. It certainly is true that that's pushing the boundaries in a lot of ways. But because it's pushing the boundaries, it also has the potential to add a lot of information to what's currently available.
I agree, and I think that reviewers really brought up some good points in terms of weaknesses, especially with the imaging.
Right.
I did also just want to say, I'm not sure if reviewer 2 was going in this direction, but it sounded to me like part of the concern might have to do also with the potential for movement artifacts among 7-year-olds, which I think is a really important point. And I did note that as I was going through the proposal as something that might have been discussed more forthrightly.
Great, thank you. Any more discussion among the reviewers? Questions, concerns, or discussion among the panel?
I was wondering, I had a question for the reviewers. Was there any part of the proposal that talked about histories of peers and family with regard to drug use or accessibility to drugs? Because those could be, mitigating factors in vulnerabilities just from a environmental standpoint.
Parental substance use is very important and does need to be assessed in this kind of context. I'm not sure that peer use would be as important given the focus on 7 to 9-year-olds for several reasons. I think the theoretical case was laid out in the proposal pretty well, that family dynamics and family factors are going to be more important at that age range in general, and perhaps even particularly so in a rural sample.
Thank you.
Any other discussion among the panel? Okay, seeing none, I'll make an attempt to summarize. So this grant examines how childhood adversity affects 2 neural risk mechanisms that are potentially predictive of subsequent drug use vulnerability. and also looks at the intersection between these neural risk mechanisms and peer, family, school, community, and protective factors, testing both buffering and compensatory effects. The project uses a low-income rural sample of children starting at age 7 who are at risk for drug misuse and following them over a period of time. The strength was noted is the topic being of great public health interest, the focus on a younger population, which was actually viewed as both a strength and possibly a limitation, but from one perspective, a strength because we don't know much about younger cohorts of individuals and the potential for drug misuse vulnerability. We also don't know much about the neural mechanisms underlying drug use vulnerability. That was noted as another strength of the study. The team was viewed as very strong with no gaps in expertise, as well as a very strong young investigator who has completed a K with preliminary data that speaks in part to the feasibility of this project. The environment was also viewed as very strong and able to support recruitment of subjects, although there was concern about recruiting 257 7-year-olds as well as their parents, and also some concerns about using imaging techniques with children at this young age and the potential possibly for movement artifacts. The proposal was viewed as highly innovative, and the dual process model was viewed as a strength, also well-grounded in the literature, and this focus on multiple factors was seen as a strength. On the other side, the lack of focus on peer influences and parental drug use or drug use vulnerability was noted as a potential weakness by some individuals reviewing the grant. There was also some concern that the dynamic nature of the data was not being fully captured, particularly the survey data, which is not going to consider the dynamic or changing nature of peer, family, and community factors. And there were also some concerns about the broad exclusion criteria, which could affect generalizability and possibly screen out some children who are in fact the most vulnerable. Other things I may have missed in summarizing the grant from the reviewers or committee. Okay, great. So with that said, if we could have final scores, please. Reviewer 1.
2.
2. Reviewer 2.
2.
And reviewer 3.
4.
4. So our range of scores for this grant are from 2 to 4. So if I would like everyone on the panel to please score the grant. Is anyone planning to score out of range?
I am.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And is that for reasons discussed?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And we'll move on to quickly ask if there are any concerns with budget with this grant. Anything that should be noted to the program officer? No
No
concerns.
concerns.
No concerns.
And we know there's no invertebrate animals. Any concern with human subjects?
I think reviewer 3 alluded to this previously, but they are low-income subjects who are being paid $350 for 3 days of testing. And so I think that the question of undue inducement is worth considering.
Great, thank you. We'll make a note of that. Great, okay. With that said, we will move on to the next grant, which is our next R01 submitted by John Doe from Emory University. The reviewers on this grant are Samantha, Niall, and Jennifer. Can we have preliminary scores, please? Reviewer 1.
3.
Reviewer 2.
2.
Reviewer 3.
5.
Thank you. Okay, reviewer 1, if you wouldn't mind summarizing the grant and your score driving factor.
Sure. This is a new application from a established investigator who is looking at cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis, or CF, is an important genetic disease that has a high mortality rate. It's caused by a mutation in the gene for cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. It's an ion transport channel. As I said, it has a very high mortality rate, and malnutrition plays an important role in the progression of CF lung disease. So the investigative team is looking at how malnutrition and visceral adipose tissue, or VAT in specifically, accumulation relates to glucose intolerance and lung function decline in this population. So they hypothesized that people with cystic fibrosis have increased VAT accumulation, which exacerbates glucose intolerance and decline in lung function. And they're proposing to use a cohort of male and female healthy control participants compared to late adolescent or early adult people with CF. They're planning to measure fat distribution, glucose intolerance, and association of body composition and fat distribution with progression of lung disease. So some of the strengths of the application were, to me, the importance of studying CF with such a high mortality rate. There are not a lot of treatments available. There are very few research studies related to nutrition in CF. It's an incredibly understudied area, and I think this study would contribute to the field quite significantly. There's also understanding how fat accumulation leads to glucose intolerance and lung function is an important aspect in potentially developing therapeutics that could target these areas. The investigative team is very strong. They have complementary expertise for the project. There's a strong history of collaboration between the individuals in funded projects, publications. They have extensive experience in recruiting study participants using a similar strategy that they've proposed here. It's a very innovative project. As I mentioned, malnutrition and nutrition in general is really an understudied area in CF. So it's very conceptually innovative. And the link between VAT and fat deposits on glucose tolerance has never been studied before. There's also strong preliminary data that's submitted to support the scientific premise that CF may increase fat accumulation, and this could lead to increased fasting glucose levels and decline in lung function. And the endpoints for each aim, I felt would yield independent contributions to the field. So none of the aims were dependent on each other's success. And of course, the environment of the Cystic Fibrosis Center and the university is very strong. A few of the weaknesses, which I felt were relatively minor, were that one of the co-investigators seems to have a more extensive role than their assigned effort may suggest. And previous studies have established that body composition and fat distribution can contribute to lung disease in people with obesity. But I think this population of CF specificity is still a really important area. And my only minor weakness in the approach was that metabolic syndromes I didn't see had been addressed and may have a confounding effect on study endpoints. So it's unclear if this history will be recorded and considered as far as participant recruitment or additional limitations of the study.
Great, thank you, Samantha. Niall.
Okay, I was obviously a little more enthusiastic than my two co-reviewers. Part of this comes from the fact that I think this is a really game-changing kind of view on how we should be dealing with the relationship between nutritional status and the development of, or the progression of CF lung disease. But I'm also a little more excited because it really ties to the development of CF-related diabetes, which is the #1 comorbidity in this population and something that we really don't understand. So reviewer #1 brought up the relationship with glucose intolerance and lung function decline in this population. So that's really an important thing for us to study. But the main thing that excites me is that the PIs are really going well past the sort of easy assessment of nutritional status that we have relied on in the CF world for years of just looking at BMI. And there has been known for years to be a direct relationship between BMI and pulmonary function and the rate of decline of pulmonary function. But there's this really odd relationship between body composition and pulmonary function that really is going deeper than just BMI. And in fact, this notion of deposition of ectopic fat in our patients is really a hitch in this sort of well understood or thought to be well understood relationship between BMI as nutritional status and pulmonary function, to the point where CF patients are often called normal weight obesity. So they look skinny, they have kind of normal weights, but they have this ectopic fat deposition, including the visceral adipose tissue that is really important here. So the novelty of this study and its clinical significance were big drivers for my score. And I think the PIs do a really good job of laying out the justification for studying that relationship between ectopic fat and progression of pulmonary disease. I agree, strong points for innovation. I thought that was really good. I think getting back to the CFRD component, so they did a nice job of selecting an age range for enrollment in this study that completely encompasses the peak range of age of onset for CFRD. So good points for study design there. Would make sense to do this in older adults, the vast majority of whom already have CF-related diabetes. So I like this. I like that point. Another main driver was that the planned study will take advantage of two really excellent CF centers, including the one here and the one at UAB. So there's a large pool of potential subjects for enrollment. And just in case, the PIs engaged an additional COI at CHOP in their CF program in case a third site is needed for accomplishing enrollment goals. And I thought that was really kind of a smart thing to do. I also like the fact that the primary sites, Emory CHOA and UAB, are using approaches that are identical, so the data can be very easily harmonized between these two primary sites. Don't know if that's the case for CHOP, but between the two primary sites, the equipment, the approaches are identical, and the data will be interpreted by a single trained individual. They didn't say at which site, but a single trained individual. So that's really going to help with harmonization across, a multi-center trial that often gets to be very difficult if the approaches are not really identical. I think the fact that there's a pretty straightforward research plan that I thought was well written, lots of detail in the approach section, and really plenty of evidence of feasibility for this study, particularly with this really great team that was developed. I thought there was good attention to power calculations and statistics, including sex as a biological variable, so points there. And frankly, the only thing that kept me from giving it a 1 overall score is that the links in the proposal to plasma redox and other pro-inflammatory markers were really not very well developed. In fact, reading through the Ames page, nothing in the sort of intro to the Ames said anything about redox or pro-inflammatory mediators. And then both of those showed up in the specific Ames themselves in sub-Ames. And so it kind of came out of nowhere. And I thought that really could have been a bit better developed. That's a fairly minor concern, but something that turned me off. I think the potential impact for this proposal is rather high for a disease that really extends across the lifespan from in utero until death, and trying to understand this relationship between nutritional status and pulmonary function that is still a bit of a black box. That's all I got.
Okay, so I thought that the age range was actually a disadvantage because they were using children. So it's helpful to hear the explanation of why this is an appropriate age range for the study. So thank you. I also didn't think they had enough information on how they were harmonizing the data, that they were collecting the body imaging data, so the DEXA and the MRI. So they will be having, even if they're scored at the same place, they have different grayscale values, and how that harmonization would be accounted for wasn't clear to me. I did think it was innovative and clearly important work. One issue with the innovation, as far as I was concerned, was that it was a bullet list of 10 innovative aspects of the proposal, which wasn't organized in any way by importance or biological variables or system or, time frame or anything. So I think they could have helped me understand what the innovations actually were if they had organized it better. And really another issue that was driving my score was the emphasis on nutrition throughout the grant as a unifying topic. So they acknowledge that there are multiple CF risk factors at the beginning that may impact body composition. So there's unrestricted diet and poor nutrition, and there's also inactivity, physical inactivity, but also systemic inflammation, growth hormone deficiency, corticosteroid use. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to body composition, and body composition was being what was measured in the specific aims, and then used for later comparison with insulin testing and lung function. So I didn't understand why there was the inherent relationship always with nutrition when there are lots of other modifiable factors that could be related and addressed with this study based on the data collected in the specific aims. So I think that the specific aims are agnostic with regard to nutrition or any other modifiable issues such as exercise, and I thought that it should be written as such. I thought sex as a biological variable was appropriate. Rigor was good. I didn't see that the reproducibility aspect, that there was going to be open data sharing or that they were registering their hypotheses. But it was clear that data would be deposited in a Center for Quality Control.
Great, thank you, reviewer 3. Discussion among reviewers.
Yeah, with respect to what reviewer 3 brought up about potential confounding variables, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is both a cross-sectional and a longitudinal study. So there's a longitudinal sub-study, and any of those things could definitely impact either the cross-sectional or the longitudinal. I was glad that they brought them up. And, the fact that they're looking at a progression of lung function decline or a progression from normal glucose tolerance to impaired to CFRD, that's gonna have a lot of opportunity for these confounding variables to come in at various rates across different populations. So you're absolutely right. But I was glad that they brought them up at least, and hopefully they can correct for that in their data analysis.
One thing that reviewer 1 brought up about I forget the phrase that was used, but obesity, but not looking like obesity.
Normal weight obesity.
Normal weight obesity. I think that's incredibly impactful, not only within this population, but in other pathological conditions that also show a similar phenotype. I think what can be learned from this study could potentially have a broader impact beyond beyond CF.
Great, thank you. Other discussion among the reviewers? Questions or discussion among the panel?
I was just interested in the reviewers' thoughts about if strong gender differences emerge, whether or not the study would be adequately powered to detect the kinds of effects that they're looking for.
I think that was addressed, but I'm not positive.
I have no idea.
It occurred to me in the context of the proposal doing a very nice job of talking about power in general and also acknowledging that they might have some difficulty recruiting their sample. And that made me then start to think more about other potential related power issues.
Any other discussion amongst the panel? Okay, I will do my best to summarize. This is a project that focuses on cystic fibrosis and the role of body composition and fat distribution on clinical outcomes by examining VAT accumulation and LBM, such as glucose intolerance and lung function. There's a high enthusiasm for the study overall, highly relevant public health issue, important genetic disease with a very high mortality rate. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around the topic. Also enthusiasm around the fact that there is a focus on a potentially modifiable factor, in this case, nutrition, although concerns were raised that nutrition was the sole focus and there could be a variety of confounding factors that were not adequately considered. Also, there was a focus on not only the fact that it potential for controllable factors in prevention, but also some implications for the potential development of therapeutics, which was also noted as a strength. The team was viewed as very strong with a particularly strong history of collaboration. Preliminary data was a plus for this particular grant application, both in terms of recruiting and some preliminary tests of their initial scientific premise. There was also a lot of positives related to the environment and the collaboration between Emory, UAB, and CHOA. There was slightly different views about the collection of data over multiple sites. On one hand, the discussion of how the sites were actually quite comparable in terms of the assessments and discussion of harmonization and one person handling the data, although another reviewer raised concerns about harmonizing the imaging data in particular. There was also a discussion of how a focus on pulmonary disease was also highly novel, and that this also was highly significant for this population. There was quite a discussion about the age range. On one hand, it was viewed as appropriate with broad implications across the lifespan. On the other hand, it was noted that that might be a weakness in terms of providing us with a perspective on a restricted population. Anything that I'm missing in my summary that the reviewers would like me to add? Okay. If we can have final scores, please. Reviewer 1.
2.
Reviewer 2.
2.
Reviewer 3.
2.
Okay, so we have no range. The score range is 2. So if I could ask everyone to please score the grant, and anyone who would like to score outside the range, if you could please indicate that. Okay. Any concerns with budget from the reviewers?
One of the co-investigators probably should have a higher commitment rate given what they're doing.
Okay, noted. Anything else? Human subjects? No concerns?
Fine.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so we will move on to our group of grants that are the R21s. And the first R21 that we will be reviewing today, and Bailey Brown is the primary investigator from Emory. The reviewers are Vivian, Ajay, and Niall. If we can have preliminary scores, please. Reviewer 1.
4.
Reviewer 2.
1.
Reviewer 3.
1.
Great. Okay, thank you. Reviewer 1, if you can please summarize the grant for us.
Yeah, certainly. So the applicants are proposing to study a already designed clinical trial of blocking IL-6 and PD-1 in order to treat PDAC. And they propose to use these samples from the clinical trial to understand the biology of this blockade. They do identify a major gap in knowledge for treating PDAC, being the tumor microenvironment and the effect of fibrotic stroma, skewed myeloid composition. However, a major weakness is that they're ignoring other factors that may have an even larger impact, such as gene instability and the genetic heterogeneity within the tumor. Another concern is that while it's certainly effective to piggyback onto a trial, there's no discussion of how to interpret the results if the trial is found to be ineffective. Their goal is to study a mechanism which will have far less significance if the results of the trial show no change in outcomes, and they only report the preliminary results from one subject in the grant. So as far as their approach, it is described in some detail, perhaps too much experimental detail and not enough discussion of how they would alter their course if the results of the trial are unfavorable, or if the trial fails to enroll sufficient subjects. So clearly lacking is alternative approaches. Innovative-wise, there does not appear to be a lot of conceptual innovation. These are targets that have been looked at several different times, just not in this precise combination. And they do acknowledge other failed trials where trying to address this fibrotic stroma has actually resulted in worse outcomes for patients. So they are using some very expensive technology, but the CyTOF is not in itself innovative. So overall, however, they are a experienced group in pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. However, in general, our 21 mechanism should be for investigators seeking to advance into other areas of research, and they don't appear to fit that model. The co-investigator does have experience with patient recruitment. However, this is a very rare disorder, and there's no discussions of adding additional sites if recruitment is insufficient. Oddly, there's no statistician on the team with very long and unclear descriptions of how they plan to analyze their data. However, they do have an excellent environment at Winship Cancer Institute, which is a leader in immunotherapy research and clinical trials, which does provide some reassurance on the feasibility of the clinical trial. So that is my summary.
Thank you. Reviewer 2.
I have a slightly different view than reviewer 1 in terms of the significance and the innovation of this specific trial. So pancreatic cancer is one of those rare malignancies, but a lethal malignancy. And we do have immunotherapies that help, but unfortunately there are scenarios that we fully don't understand how exactly the resistance mechanisms happen for these immunotherapies. So in this context, they were trying to see what are the barriers for that, what are the factors that restrain the immunity in the pancreatic adenocarcinomas. And their hypothesis is that IL-6 is a critical factor that promotes inflammatory cancer-associated fibroblasts that create a wall for the immunotherapy to reach out to the pancreatic cancer. So very innovative design, the trial design that has been implemented in here. So in this grant mechanism, they're not asking for the monies to run a trial, but what they're asking is for the correlatives to be supported. And this is a pancreatic cancer, and the field that they're looking at is with immunotherapy, and they do have good investigators in terms of the immunotherapy gurus that really form a part of this group. So what they propose is to fully understanding they're employing the single cell CyTOF to gain a deeper insight into how the clinical use of this anti-IL-6 impacts the biology of both the tumor as well as the T cells in the context of the PD-1 blockade. So they propose the mechanism of using every patient will be receiving the dual blockade, but to understand where exactly the dual blockade helps, there is a staggered phase of introducing the second agent with serial biopsies 3 weeks apart, so that every patient gets the benefit of the dual blockade. At the same time, they're understanding what each of these agents would be contributing to in terms of understanding the insight into the immune approach. So in my opinion, this is very well-designed study, and we're using the correlatives at different time points with with longitudinal biopsies to understand more about the mechanism. And this is very novel with good investigators, which led me to give it a score of a 1.
Great, thank you. Reviewer 3?
Yeah, I really like this proposal, obviously, from my overall score. But based on some comments from reviewer 1, I'm going to probably go to a 2. But in terms of what I really liked about it, I really think it's a very well-crafted study. And I love that it's taking advantage of this opportunity to collect samples from biopsies from the patients undergoing what I thought was a pretty well-designed clinical trial. And it's just a really good opportunity to address this controversy of the role of interleukin-6 in restraining immune targeting of PDAC cells. And it just seems like this is a great time to, take advantage of that clinical trial. I thought the preliminary data are really strong, building on work from 2 ongoing R01 funded projects that are pursued primarily in mice. So being able to shift into this opportunity to study, patient-derived samples from this clinical trial-based proposal that they want to link to, I think is really great. It builds on extensive preclinical data. The reason why I am going to change my score is related to reviewer 1's comment that they don't really have any way to interpret the data if the trial results don't show what they think they're going to show. I had as a strength in my score drivers that all the data from this analysis of tumor biopsies and blood will be interpreted in relation to clinical outcomes for the patients. So if there is no difference in the clinical outcomes for the patients, how do they deal with that? Right. So I think that is a significant weakness. And so I'm going to go from a 1 to a 2.
Great, thank you. Discussion among the panel.
I would love to see the expected results and how they would change as well. And you bring a great point, which I haven't thought before, and I'm willing to go down to 2 as well.
Any other discussion among the panel? Any questions from the full panel, particularly maybe related to this idea of the contingent aims?
Do you think that there's going to be something new to be gained from at least one of the aims? I'm just asking from, and is that endpoint contingent upon the others?
I don't see anything new to be learned if neither therapy, either together or alone, is effective. And had they included some kind of precision medicine aspect to it to better understand the patient diversity, I would have felt more positive towards this grant. But it's purely protein focused, and I think that again is a real weakness.
Any
Probably results that
Go ahead. I'm
1
sorry.
to 2 is like this.
Any further discussion, Ajay?
probably the results from this trial and the correlatives probably might allow them to learn more to design a trial in the future, going back to the research.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, if this were an R01, I'd probably give it a different score, but it's an R21. that is well linked to this clinical trial. So it could really serve as basis for providing new hypotheses that can be tested in model.
Yeah, of course, that's you kind of putting it on top of the grant. They never think that way. They seem unfortunately overconfident that it's going to give a positive result.
Great, thank you. Okay, I will attempt to summarize the grant. This is a clinical trial that focuses on improving the efficacy of immunotherapy in patients with PDAC. It capitalizes on data from an existing or ongoing clinical trial. In particular, there's a focus on the role of IL-6 as a key mechanism for maintaining a microenvironment that contributes to immunotherapy resistance against PDAC through its effects on immune cells. The project also proposes to target IL-6 reprograms and TME and enhances the efficacy of immunotherapy in this population. The positives of this grant were that it appeared to identify a major gap in knowledge, which would be the tumor microenvironment, although there was a corollary weakness related to ignoring gene instability and gene heterogeneity. It is well linked to the clinical trial. However, there appear to be significant concerns related to, at least from some of the reviewers, related to the contingencies of the aims. In other words, if the clinical trial is not successful or does not yield clear findings, it's unclear how this work would proceed. And this was seen by some as a significant weakness. There were differences of opinion regarding preliminary data. Reviewer 1 indicated preliminary data from a sample of 1 was concerning, although another reviewer felt that they had considerable preliminary data, perhaps other preliminary data. There was also a strength from shifting from mice models to patients and building nicely on preclinical data that was available. Other minor concerns had to do with conceptual innovation and that the approach itself was not highly innovative. And the analytic approach was not well described. Another reviewer saw the grant as more innovative in terms of identifying factors that put people at risk for immunity, and that there were new questions that were being asked about basic processes that might be responsible for the efficacy of immunotherapy. There was some concern about, as I think I may have mentioned this, there was not a statistician on the team, but the environment was viewed as highly appropriate and strong. Anything I should add to this summary? Okay. With that said, could we have final scores, please? Reviewer 1.
I'm staying at a 4.
Reviewer 2.
2.
Reviewer 3.
2.
Great. And if everyone else on the panel can please score, is anyone planning on scoring outside the range? Okay, great. And are there concerns with budget?
Actually, yes. The work they're proposing is extremely costly, going to be done on quite a lot of samples if enrollment is met. I don't see how this can be done with an R21 budget.
Okay, thank you. Any concerns with human subjects, this patient population? Secondary data, but any concerns?
No concerns.
Okay, great. All righty. Lauren or Gray, if you can bring us back to the PowerPoint. Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much to the reviewers. That was certainly an interesting adventure. Really appreciate the insights. And we have a good bit of time. It looks like we have some comments in the chat. I don't know, Kathy, do you think we should have some questions first? Maybe if any questions that might be posed, and then we can have the panel talk a little bit about kind of whether they thought this was realistic, other than the fact that the study section chair doesn't have a background in basic science, and any tips and tricks or common flaws they see. So Kathy, if you can maybe help moderate that, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. So we do have a question in the chat. I think it's, it's worth really being explicit about this, which is whether the budget and human subjects comments are mentioned for feedback without affecting the score or a subsequent percentile, or do they have weight in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I can weigh in based on my experience, but I'd like others to chime in too. In the type of work that I've seen in study sections around human subjects, it could actually affect the score if it's something that is a serious problem. However, normally human subjects concerns would be, addressable and minor and not affect the scoring. So for example, let's say you were doing a study and you were getting data from drug abuse counselors in a work environment and you did not have informed consent, right? Or you were going to share that information might be potentially damaging to their employment, and there was no discussion of human subjects. That could be a scoreable issue, but by and large, it would not be considered scoreable. Others?
For like my review of Grant 2, the reason I mentioned the co-investigator commitment issue as part of my review was about their commitment to the project, which I think is a different question than the budget, although they are somewhat related.
Yeah,
So
that would probably be more like concerns with the investigative team, possibly, right? Sam?
Yeah, right. So it's not exactly a budget that's affecting like the score, but it's the investigative team that then is affected.
So if you have any other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. In the meantime, I want to pose the question to the panel, which is how similar was what we just did to your experience with study sections? What are things that you've seen happen that were not reflected in what we did today?
Kathy, from the study sections that I sit on, I see a lot more discussion from the review panel that were not reviewers, right? The rest of the committee. The way that we did this mock study section, the whole panel didn't have access to a ton of grants and a ton of time to read all of them, right? And so most, as was said before by Lillian, most of the panels I'm on are like, 35 people in the room. And so several people will have read every grant that is of interest to them, or at least the Ames page. And so the relevance of the study and, sort of state of the art that might have been missed by the reviewer or by the proposer, I think is often discussed a lot more in a real study section.
Yes, I agree. Are there other thoughts from the committee?
I also think that as the day goes on, it sort of, at least in the ones I've participated on, the primary reviewer really drives the score because they're the ones talking the most, at the end point of the day, where the secondary and third and reviewer 3 probably aren't adding as much unless they really feel strongly about it.
Although I will say that I've seen reviewer 3 kill more grants than reviewer 1 probably.
Yeah.
Reviewer 3 does not have as close an expertise to the grant as reviewers 1 and 2. And so you saw that happen a little bit today when Andre was talking, where he didn't have the same expertise, but he was able to identify some major issues.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, you look like you were about to say something. No?
Well, I'm just agreeing.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems like one thing that could have happened, and I wasn't sure in my role as study section because I've never been a study section chair. I probably could have done it. Would be, I think that there was possibly some misalignment between scoring and comments that were made. And so often that will happen if someone is, for example, gives something a high score and then is pretty critical in their review. Another reviewer will say, well, your score doesn't seem to match your comments. And we didn't have much of that today. I think I've kind of forgotten which one it might have been that grant number 2 where I felt like maybe that could have been posed, but I wasn't sure that I should do that. So that's something that happens pretty regularly, I'd say.
I should have clarified that I was changing my score based on the discussion and the expertise in the room.
Any other thoughts about differences or common things that you see? And there is another question in the chat, which is a really good one, which was asking us to comment on how or if the dynamics of the discussion has impacted the process by doing reviews online or in person. Anybody want to take that one?
Online sucks. Hate it. Hate it.
But I don't know that it really is changing things in terms of making the review outcomes different.
But I would say I've heard a lot of people complain that cameras go off when they're not speaking, and then so people aren't paying as close attention to the discussion as they do when you're sitting in a room facing each other. I don't know if others have heard that as well, but that is one thing I've heard.
And you can see, just looking around the room, you can see who's paying attention, who's not, who's checking their email, etc. But you can also, get a feel for like when you're presenting your comments, you might even look at someone in the room that has expertise on a certain nugget of the proposal that you're wanting to see a reaction from when you make your comments. And that's just really hard to do when it's online.
I think the other drawback of online is that when you serve on as a permanent member, a standing member of a study section, you get to know your fellow reviewers pretty well over the couple of years that you serve on study section. The group usually goes out to dinner together the one night. You're not supposed to talk about the grants while you're out at dinner, but you do get to know folks better. So number one, it's good for networking. But number two, I think it also makes it easier to have a discussion, to maybe question someone when you feel comfortable with them. Any other comments on that question? So what advice do all of you have for people trying to choose a study section, or what is the single most important thing they can do to avoid falling into some of the traps that happened during the review process?
I guess I'll start by reminding the audience that it is not usually the case that all three of your reviewers are really going to know the field as well as maybe the primary, but you have to really be able to convince people, A, that you know the field, and B, that your study is important and well crafted in the field. So, the CF proposal we did here today, proposal number 2, obviously I know the proposer, I know CF inside and out. So, that's not going to be the case for most assigned reviewers.
Thanks. Ajay, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I will give you one of the experiences that we had. So it was similar to, there's a hater in every panel. So you certainly, if you're not, if the comments, like the comments I made from the social behavioral aspect, like may not make any sense. So when you go through the comments, you can clearly see, and you can talk to the program officer to ask for somebody who's aligned for the next time, which we've done in the past.
And so what, it brings up the good question of what do you do if you get back a review and one of the reviewers, often reviewer 3, was clearly off base, hadn't read the proposal or misinterpreted everything. And the first thing I do is get angry. The second thing I do is say, all right, how could I have rephrased this so it would be more understandable? But sometimes they're just flat wrong. And so what do you do in that case? Surely somebody's got an answer to that. Go ahead, Sam.
I first write out all of my angry things and then put that in the shredder, and then I start again. So, I mean, I try to address the comments as professionally and as calmly and as completely as I can. So even if it's not something I necessarily agree with, then considering that and refuting it as, if a reviewer mentions a study that I have neglected to include, but that is one that's really important to them, I might include that and then state what the gap in knowledge that paper doesn't cover and how this study might address that. Or try to acknowledge what the comments are, but really state why the impact of what I'm proposing surpasses those comments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add too that it is possible that one didn't do as good of a job as they could as explaining something, right? And so I think also just acknowledging, apologizing if there's confusion, but actually you were proposing to do X, Y, and Z. Like if there's really a misinterpretation where they think you had an active control group or had a passive control group, but you really had an active control group. I mean, like a real error. I think you could start by saying, apologies if there was not explained well enough, but actually we have active control group that has a highly similar but distinct intervention. So I do think sometimes we have to step back and see, is it something in the way that I communicated that I didn't hammer it enough? I mean, one thing to remember is people are reading a lot of grants. And so repetition, I think, can be really important of key points. And to Niall's comment, you're not writing to the people who are necessarily doing the research in this area. You're writing to just smart scientists who know enough to be dangerous sometimes, right? So kind of saying the same point, important same points repeatedly, really thinking about clearly communicating and writing for a very different kind of audience. It's not scientific writing like you would write for a high impact journal that you would submit a manuscript to. Very, very different. So that's just another way to think about it too.
Have any of you ever gone to the program officer to say you thought the review was unfair or inaccurate?
I did once, because there was just obviously wrong things, like them saying something I hadn't actually said. So, and the program officer agreed that those were inaccuracies, but had an interesting take on it that the reviewers already decided if they're going to fund you or not, very early. And all these inaccuracies are kind of irrelevant. That's them kind of trying to support their decision, which they may do with varying accuracy, which is a very unsatisfying answer, but that's what I got.
Agreed. But it does point out the importance of the Ames page. Go ahead, AJ.
So we had a sport grant, so where there's an engineer that needed to be on, and we have requested the program officer specifically to have an engineer on the grant, not just the myeloma folks.
I think sometimes too, you can end up in the wrong study section if you're not careful. And so that can also be kind of part of the problem. And I've had that happen before. You can specify the study section that you prefer in a cover letter. I've always done that, but I ended up it was a workplace intervention, but I ended up in a clinical trial study section. And so very, very different. Workplace intervention is very different than a patient clinical trial. And some of the comments were very much off base. And the program officer said, well, you just need to resubmit and let's make sure it gets somewhere else. So that choice of the study section, you do have some, you can make recommendations in a cover letter, and I would strongly advise you to do that. Make sure you talk to a program officer, determine which study section would be the most appropriate for your work, because they have their own kind of cultures as well, right? The different study sections.
I can't agree with that more. The study section that it goes to is absolutely critical. So
I was going to mention the study section assignment form that you fill out also has a section that asks about relevant expertise. So if there's a study section that you're trying to target and maybe they don't necessarily have somebody in your specific area, you could request that they add someone. my area is alcohol and lung, but there aren't that many alcohol and lung people, and there's no alcohol and lung study section. So I end up usually in a lung immunology study sections or lung injury and repair, and I request an alcohol expertise to be added, and usually they honor those requests.
That's a good tip.
And I've done that too, Sam, successfully as well.
Go ahead. Yeah, Niall.
2 points. First off, with respect to choosing study section, there is a tool that the NIH provides called Assisted Referral Tool, ART. And you basically put in keywords for your proposal, and it will help you find what is the best, or a few suggestions of what might be the best study section. And then you have to go in and check those out and really make sure they're appropriate. Second thing I wanted to say was really getting back to Lillian's question about how do you handle it when different reviewers have different takes on a proposal. This is less relevant to the submitter, but more relevant to when you eventually wind up on a study section yourself. Not every agency does this, but most agencies will enable the reviewers to see other people's comments, even if you don't know who they belong to, but other reviewers' comments ahead of the study section. So you can go in knowing what were the major weaknesses someone raised or the major positive strengths that someone raised, and kind of have a real cogent, maybe not argument, but discussion of those points lined up before the study section starts. And that really helps. I can tell when I'm on study section, I can tell the people that do that from the people that don't. The reviewers that do that versus the reviewers that don't.
It's a good point. You also bring up a good point. I'd like to give for you all to give some advice on what to do when you have a review where the comments from reviewer 1 are completely opposite the comments from reviewer 2. Or reviewer 1 says you need to cut aim 1, it's not innovative. Reviewer 2 says aim 1 is the best part of the grant, or something like that. How do you handle that? We've all had it happen.
I usually call my program officer and go, what do I do? What are you guys interested in? What do you think? Like, how did the discussion go? So even though, the comments may read that way, maybe the discussion was a little bit different, and may point to another direction. That's usually where I start, and then go from there.
Other approaches, you're right, Sam. They often can give you more insight.
Yeah, I want to add to that. Sorry, I talk way too much, guys. Some of this comes down to grantsmanship, right? So if you can predict what, especially an uninformed or a partially uninformed reviewer might consider a major weakness, you got to be able to think ahead about how you can argue that that's not a problem before you submit the proposal, right? And so that is only going to happen if you get out of your echo chamber and have other people read your grant, particularly people that are not exactly in your field and don't know all the jargon, don't know all the state-of-the-art stuff. So you really it behooves you to get other successful investigators to read your proposal a month ahead of the deadline, not a day or two ahead of the deadline, so you can actually change it.
And it's good to look at the study section, standing members, see what they do. Like when I was trying to be the hater for that grant, I pictured myself being somebody who studies a lot of the, genetics of the cancer, and they'd be offended that, it was never mentioned and it wasn't considered.
Yeah. Good enough.
Doing some homework and understanding the culture of the study section is really helpful. You can also use disagreeing reviewers to your advantage when you're responding. So if one reviewer hates something, the other loves it, and you love it too, you tell the first reviewer, well, reviewer 2 really wanted us to keep this, and we agree because XYZ. right, so let's take just 5 minutes or so here at the end of our session to talk about common flaws. I will start by saying that for new investigators, the most common criticism is overambitious. Overambitious, too much. You get excited about what you're doing and you put in 20 years worth of work into your 5-year grant. So make sure that what you're doing is actually feasible. What other common flaws do you see?
Not hypothesis driven.
Yeah, for basic science grants especially. Steve?
Related to what you were talking about, there's a common tendency for people to be too complicated.
Yes.
Simplicity is a real virtue in grant writing and very difficult for most of us.
Agreed.
Jennifer, were you going to add something?
I was just gonna say poor grantsmanship often is thought to reflect poor science, right? And so you want to give people a reason to, or you don't want them to have any reason to reject your work. And so you want to make it be as careful as you can, following instructions and building a good case.
I think the contingent aims is something that I certainly see a lot. And for me personally, I struggle with that as a reviewer in terms of, I thought there were some counter arguments that were made about the contingent aims, I think in the third grant, but I think that is pretty common. If aim 1 crashes and aim 2 is assuming that aim 1 is successful, that can be really problematic.
We have a comment from someone in the chat about clues to which of the reviewers' perspectives were reflected in the final outcome in the summary of the panel discussion. I'm glad you brought that up, because when you get your summary statement, you do get a summary of the discussion. And even though it may seem a little redundant based on reading the reviewers' comments, that's where you're going to figure out where the focus of the discussion was and what things you really need to focus on when you respond. Sam or Ajay, anything to add?
I was going to say that there's a fine line between rigor of prior research and preliminary data, and then what you're proposing and its novelty. So, choosing what you include very carefully to not shoot yourself in the foot for impact is sort of a fine line.
I think the most important part of the entire grant is the aims page. And if you're not able to convince the initial aspect, a reviewer should be able to pass through the aims page. And those 200 words are the most important part of the entire grant. So in Winship, we recognize that as one of the barriers to getting good reviews. So there is a opportunity for any of the investigators in Winship to submit their aims page, and you'd get a feedback. This is run by Larry Boyce, but there is a actual review process that he conducts. It is open for anyone, and basically to talk about just how to improvise on your aims page. So that is the most important part in my opinion, for somebody to turn the page to the next page. You have to pass through, to convince that this is worth it.
Absolutely. And for anyone in the audience, I would refer you to the first session of this series, where we spent quite a bit of time talking about how to write a strong aims page. And that is on the Georgia CTSA website, if you'd like to see it. So I want to thank everyone on the panel for participating, taking the time to review a grant, prepare a review, share your experiences. It was very well done. So thank you all. And I will turn it back to Lillian to close us out.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I echo that. It's not easy to come into these things and to ask you all to do this heavy lifting on top of your normal workload. So we really do appreciate it. We also really want to thank the audience for being here. We have a big group, and we certainly appreciate your time and attention. We hope that you learned something from this and that it gives you a kind of a sneak peek behind the curtain.